you have to make sure to do it. I'm going to share down next time. This is really my first time trying to use YouTube set like that. But at any rate, so what I really want to do is kind of. Wait 1 second. I hope you can hear me okay. All right. Okay, so if you can hear me, just let me know if I'm cutting in or out. That'd be helpful. Just let me know in the chat if I do disconnect. So going forward, yeah, so I had the pleasure and honor to be back on TMBS on Tuesday and speaking with Lisha Brooks about Michael Brooks' last live stream when he was talking about integral theory, its applications, its relevance or import in terms of building a constructive political movement that is synthetic and regenerative oriented and so on. But there was a lot in that particular video that Michael had done that I thought it might benefit us to actually kind of do a little bit of a deep dive with that. So there's a few things, right? Like Michael recommended the Theory of Everything text by Ken Wilber, and with a lot of caveats that the text is probably not so good with politics and some elements of it are dated, maybe just sort of cultural context of the late 90s, early 2000s. But as a whole, the style or method of thinking integratively that Ken Wilber puts forward, and he's not the only guy who puts this forward, could be helpful not only for the left, but really for the situation in which we find ourselves in which there's deep atomization, profound polarization, alienation, etc. And much of this engendered by the social media environments and techno-cultural economic markets that exceed and do very well in this kind of atomization in terms of creating micro communities and niches and sort of like our own reality tunnels and our own kind of well-catered algorithmed social media bubbles, right? So we're in a period of deep atomization, and the internet, while it seems to have, in a sense, connected us in a way we hadn't been able to before around the planet, there's also this dichotomy or paradoxical way in which it seems to be increasing disconnection and atomization. So we're kind of living in a time in which making connections, jumping across borders and boundaries and disciplines, thinking in ways that are complex and interconnected, relating to one another in a very human-centric way in terms of cultivating some kind of on-the-ground empathy and compassion that is not filtered through the reality bubble of our online media and where we're getting our news sources, but actually being able to meet people face-to-face and build something on the ground. And I would say that the import that Michael was arguing for wasn't even just for the left per se, but really it's something that we as a whole, as a species, need at this time of existential threat. In my circles, in my community, we call this the meta crisis. It's also the climate crisis and the economic one and the political one, etc. But meta and kind of going meta, I have some critiques of that, but in general, it's just a shorthand word for talking about the multi-systemic structural collapse and impotency even of the prevailing social order that we're struggling with right now and that we're attempting to supersede or not, right? So this is the kind of the moment that we're in. On the one hand, this is an economic crisis. On the other, it's a social. And then, of course, it's in the entire planet in the context of being in the midst of a dire ecological collapse and climate crisis. It's also a planetary one. But the flip side of this, and this is really where I think Michael's desire to put forward something like a synthesis or something constructive rather than merely appraising the situation doing that, right, at a bare minimum, having a very clear sense of the reality of the situation that we're in, while at the same time offering something constructive and perhaps as a way that could get us out of this mess, or lead us to at least more helpful and generative possibilities in the near future. So, one of the things he mentions was, in terms of cosmopolitan socialism, right? He talks about having empathy, patience, and the capacity for synthesis, right? And so, like, for any of you who are just joining the stream and curious about integral theory, to circle back to that one book by Wilber, and that might be a good book because it was marketed actually as a kind of, it was probably for sale in airports as one of those kind of books, but it was kind of marketed as an accessible entryway point to thinking about integral theory with some light commentary on culture and politics, etc. So that's a good one. I would also probably recommend another shorthand one, if you can sort of overcome some of the polemics in it, which may be a little dated at this point, but A Brief History of Everything. And I know in my stream with Lisha, I mentioned the Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, which is back there. It's a kind of a giant tome, a few hundred pages long, and massive footnotes. And again, there's a lot of little issues here, but generally speaking, what I was talking about, what I think Michael was very interested in, was that the quadrant model that Ken Wilber puts forward, for instance, enabling us to think about subjective and intersubjective, objective, right? So we try to think about things as a whole, and how different approaches to, let's say, the economic crisis need to sort of be, it's kind of a cheap word these days, but it's nevertheless, if we go back to its meaning, holistic, in the sense of oriented towards wholeness, oriented towards remediation, not leaving out important dimensions of human experience in the life world. It's a model that helps us sort of keep that in mind. And I mentioned it as a kind of a training wheel metaphor because, there's an interesting lecture or chat by Jamie Wheel talking about this too, in the sense that the model itself is really aimed at kind of getting you to think with complexity, getting you to keep different schools of thought and different disciplines that might focus more on the individual and then some more on systems, but being able to have literacy and a comfort or a fluidity of thinking to be able to move across these disciplines and see how they interrelate with one another will give us overall a stronger approach and a more systemic approach to our problems than to sort of failing to and also falling prey to the kind of atomization of thinking that we see sort of engendered in the rest of culture right now, right? Hyper-specialization is a way in which the universities and knowledge disciplines have gone, perhaps just through no real kind of active fault of their own, but just in the process of refining knowledge, we have become deeply, deeply specialized. And these different disciplines, on the other hand, are also not very good at talking with one another. And so the age of the internet, it has these sort of ironies in terms of the potential of interconnecting many different knowledge disciplines and constructing a more fluidic and dynamic and responsive kind of age of information, in the sense that information is not static. We have to participate with it. It's enactive, right? En. In the sense of what the philosopher Bruno Latour talks about with actor network theory. So there's a lot of potential in the internet age and in the age of interconnectivity, but it seems that our styles of thinking and even the kind of social and communal technologies and practices are not really being emphasized. And this is something I talked about with Michael as well, just in the sense of, in my own field, in this sort of weird hippie counterculture field of consciousness studies and complexity sciences, and, talking about things like Gaia hypothesis and deep ecology on the one hand, and then on the other talking about different states of consciousness or psychedelic studies. It's a very varied field. Integral theory is sort of part of this field of kind of outlier knowledge and studies. But what interested us, I think, the most, and what we were very resonant on, was the particular communities, like in the 1960s, growing into the 1970s, beginning then historically, which were very interested, and maybe they didn't have a deeply rooted historical analysis of of capitalism and of economics. Some of them did. Some of them were very very involved in particularly in just sort of post-capitalist movements, etc. But communities were trying to imagine the world beyond industrial capitalism. Now, some of their approaches may be limited. Some of them may be a little dated. Some of them may not be as synthetic with the history of the left in terms of labor movements and theory, etc. But what I think Michael saw in those, and myself, is an attempt. I'm going to use the word synthesis, but I don't think it's quite that. But for convenience sake of this conversation, a synthesis of bringing together folks who are at the sort of outlying countercultural communities, practicing intentional communities, and I'm not just talking about hippie communes, but certainly there's a history and tradition of that. The Whole Earth Catalog, the Lindisfarne Association, and different communities like this that were trying to go like, well, how do we get past this? How do we get past the war machine and U.S. imperialism, industrial capitalism that's destroying the environment? The environmental movement was really kicking in the 60s and 70s. And they were talking about climate change back then as well. So it was all kind of in this context of thinking more towards the ecological, more towards the environmental and planetary, and beyond the forces of capital, right? Beyond the forces of industrial capital. I think the Lindisfarne Association is probably one of the most historically robust experiments in thinking beyond industrial capitalism, with very different views therein. But what I think Michael found interesting about the Lindisfarne Association particularly was its unique bringing together of artists and scientists and poets. We had folks like Wendell Berry, Carl Sagan, Gregory Bateson, I think eventually Nora Bateson. So we have this sort of systems thinkers, we have poets, Lynn Margulis, which she was a brilliant scientist talking about symbiotic evolution and Gaia hypothesis. James Lovelock, William Irwin Thompson himself was an MIT professor of history who kind of went out into the counterculture to explore these innovative ideas. And so I think, bringing those kinds of ideas into the context of movement building and scaling a movement today is this question of, okay, well, what ideas do they have? Speaking of ideas, you can go the IDW around, say ideas, but the concepts and ideas that the counterculture, I think, we're offering permitted us for a moment to think outside of capitalism, to think even outside of civilization. And so bringing them into the context of our current crisis in terms of post-capitalism, in terms of the climate crisis that we're in right now, in terms of more contemporary analysis like Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, I do think some of these movements and their literature and some of their concepts are worth examining, particularly how they were articulating the kind of thinking they were trying to embody. And I think they were talking about this in terms of like systems theory, talking about Bateson, in a time before the internet even, right? Really in a time before the digital age. So I think a lot of their literature has to be considered in kind, right? And kind of updated a little bit. But generally speaking, they were advocating for the kind of thinking that Michael Brooks was talking about in terms of building empathy, having patience in terms of a different orientation and relationship with time, and generally speaking, the capacity to think integratively and with complexity. I want to mention, thanks Adam in the comments was mentioning The Integral Vision. It's a great coffee table sized book. So that's another little book you could get in terms of Wilber's integral theory. And again, integral theory came a little bit later. Ken Wilber himself is sort of coming out of the history of California consciousness. We can look at this more in a historical vein and kind of trace the movement of Whole Earth Catalog and these countercultures moving from the 60s into the 70s in intentional communities to the 1980s in the Silicon Valley and the kind of beginnings of cyberculture. And I mentioned this in TMBS with Fred Turner's excellent book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, which actually traces this movement historically. And I think, reveals some of the kind of economic and market capture of some of these communities and ideas, but also the potential to turn them again. And to just throw out another connection here, I think Douglas Rushkoff's work, specifically his work on Team Human and some of his more recent books like Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus and the book itself, Team Human, which is sort of a little manifesto, are really kind of trying to turn the countercultural element once again in cyberculture, right? In terms of the sort of radical potentialities that they were speaking about. And I'm not just talking about the sort of libertarian streak of early 90s, late 80s cyberculture, but the more revolutionary streak in terms of how they were imagining, a radically free and open society and what the kind of, what kind of social structures the digital culture or digital technology communications could engender. That, to me anyway, has not been fully realized, and I think with Rushkoff's work, he's also sort of exploring that. So I want to leave that there. But I bring all this in mind to kind of bring us into a historical context of who Ken Wilber was and why Michael found him interesting, why I found him interesting and still appreciate his integrative thinking. But in the 1980s and late 1970s, we see the kind of commodification of the so-called New Age culture, the move away from really kind of radical claims of let's live differently, let's experiment with different forms of economics and social systems, etc. So we have that turning, and I think particularly we have to look at how, in the context of integral theory, historically speaking, they are really it's emerging from the transpersonal movement, on the one hand, which is sort of stemming from California and Esalen Institute, etc., which had a deeply psychological emphasis, right? Thinking about Maslow and the human potential movement of the 70s and 80s. Maslow's hierarchy of needs and looking at ways in which we can, exceed our own programming and culture, our own individualism, right? To really kind of self-realize or to self-actualize, looking at spirituality as a means of adult self-actualization. So very kind of individualized psychology movement that sort of stemmed from some of these earlier historical kind of countercultural communities interested in consciousness, etc. And it's really out of that context that Wilber himself emerged. He wrote a book called The Spectrum of Consciousness back in the late 70s. And then in the 1980s, he continued to write in what was then called transpersonal culture and transpersonal meaning, extending the human potential movement, really emphasizing spiritual experience, right? The validity of spiritual experience for human health and well-being, and perhaps even as a kind of counterweight to, increasingly materialist and atomized culture, right? So it was a kind of romantic turn towards spirituality on the one hand, and it was drawing from the disciplines of psychology and particularly Abraham Maslow and other kind of interesting psychologists in California, consciousness culture, again, Esalen, etc. And that in turn, you can turn that another decade back, and I won't get into it deeply, but you can say, Esalen was really kind of born out of 1960s counterculture with Alan Watts and psychedelics and the kind of percolating psychedelia of California, particularly Northern California, and particularly San Francisco, stemming from California Institute of Integral Studies, which was East-West psychology back then. The religious studies scholar Frederick Spiegelberg kind of inspiring Michael Murphy to go ahead and create Esalen in the first place. So there's a whole history here. And I would also drop in Jeffrey Kripal's book called Esalen, if you're curious about that. So this is really where Wilber is kind of emerging from in terms of his context. So he's going to be drawing a lot from what he says in the quadrant model, the upper left, which is individualistic, sort of interior world, right? So the aqua model has the exterior and interior, and in the top left of that quadrant model, it's designated as sort of the individual interior dimension. And so for Wilber, that may be just one quadrant, but really his entire kind of theoretical framework is drawing from the work and the research in psychology when he begins to speak about development and stages of development and cultural evolution. And I would say this too in terms of discerning two things. That the emphasis in my conversations with Michael Brooks tended to be more about just getting people to think with complexity and depth. There wasn't so much of an emphasis on the stage-centric modeling that is all throughout integral theory and Ken Wilber and all these different colors and all these different value memes, etc. Those might be interesting. I find them to be a little bit too reductionist and a little bit too neat and clean. It's almost antithetical to the aqua map, which tends to be, if we use it the correct way, I think it could be much more dynamic, right? Everything is interrelated with everything else. And again, it's a kind of a training wheel to begin thinking like that and to begin to be jumping across our different schools of thought and sort of seeing, even when they sort of disagree with one another, that they're really emphasizing, let's say, collective social systems, and then another might be emphasizing not social systems, not the sociological, but maybe the environmental and the economic. And of course, those two interconnect, right? So it's a way to remind ourselves that everything is entangled in terms of having a theory of how societies evolve, and then also how to approach any one problem. It's entangled in pretty much everything else. But this is a helpful map to really sort of clarify how that entanglement is actually going on. And that might be a way to sum up some of this here. So Wilber came out of that, and I would say that, in terms of literature, if you are going to be going through it and studying him at all, again, theory of everything is good. Adam was mentioning integral vision. That would also be quite good. And I would also add Sex Ecology, Spirituality for the deep dive. It's sort of Wilber's famous text. His 1980s work is really emphasizing more of, it's really speaking more to the transpersonal movement, looking at the history of consciousness. And his 1990s work then begins to move into this like more meta-theoretical approach where he is trying to develop a theory of everything. And then he does introduce that quadrant map that we've been mentioning. And so I think you might find his 90s work to be the most interesting. Another one I really should mention is A Marriage of Sense and Soul, which it's a kind of a case study of that quadrant integrative framework, because what Wilber's doing in that is really kind of tackling the, for the most part, the kind of the now quaint cultural climate of the early 2000s. If you remember in that time, there was a lot of debate. It was the Bush era about the new atheist movement, and we had the religious right, and that was kind of the deepest political concerns of at least liberal media and the talking points and everything. And I know some of the new atheists were insufferable, but certainly that was the kind of climate at the time. And Wilber was interesting because he was attempting to appeal to the more rational secular thinker, and make a case for spirituality. He was bringing in different philosophers, different schools of thought, and he was bringing in his integrative model, kind of showing that we can make a case for an integral spirituality and an integral philosophical approach to spiritual thinking and spiritual experience that isn't necessarily just, religious fundamentalism. It's not that or secularism. There is a way to kind of bring these modes of thinking together. And say what you will about the conclusions and the arguments, I find that to be another fun book to recommend to people in terms of, it's a quick read, interesting arguments. Maybe it's a little antiquated now because of, it's from another time, but it nevertheless is enjoyable, and it can kind of show you how this integrative model works. And all that being said, there's a few other things I wanted to bring up, because with Wilber, again, his politics and what Michael meant about that, a few years ago during the Jordan Peterson IDW meteoric rise into cultural discussion, right? There was a lot of talk about, what is Peterson and the IDW really, what's their appeal for culture? And I think this is where, two things. Over 15 years ago, again, during this Bush era conversation when integral theory was much more popular, it was having more of its day in culture. Wilber was performing a similar mediational space. I wouldn't say exactly to Jordan Peterson and the IDW, but he was making an argument for rational meaning making, and he was doing so in a way that was a little bit more accessible. This is not, his writing wasn't for academics. He was putting out those more popular cultural books like A Marriage of Sense and Soul, or A Theory of Everything, or A Brief History of Everything, if we go back a few more years. And he was really kind of talking to the cultural distinctions that were going on in the kind of larger cultural conversation. The rise of feminism, progressive politics in academia and in culture, and its backlash. He was commenting on those trends or those developments in culture at that time. So when the IDW kind of exploded a few years ago, I think we began to see a kind of an interest in Wilber's work by the IDW, because people were going, Wilber critiqued to a more limited extent than Peterson, but Wilber critiqued the rise of progressive culture in the 1990s. And he was doing this in the context of academia because he was very critical of the atomization, the specialization of knowledge, and the kind of postmodern style of thinking in terms of deconstructing meta-narratives, all that stuff. Wilber was really interested in building meta-narratives again, and having big picture thinking, and synthesizing the best of what Derrida and Foucault and the deconstructionists were saying with the period before that, which had more generalist and structuralist approaches to thinking. So Wilber, I think, was very frustrated by that kind of culture, and he was sort of complaining about its excesses in the 90s and 2000s. And to some extent, as I grew up reading Wilber, I kind of acknowledged, that criticism, but I do think Wilber really kind of felt jabbed by the postmodern academic left, and felt a sense of frustration with not being heard, perhaps not having his ideas accepted in the university. So, if we fast forward a little bit to today, there is a sense that his thinking was speaking about some of the cultural issues that are still going on in our time. And so Wilber himself began a kind of courting with the IDW. He began to say that, Jordan Peterson is an integral thinker, et cetera. And both Michael and I, and if you listen to our podcast, it's episode 5 of Mutations, there was a clear sense that, obviously Wilber's politics tended to lean into centrism and even kind of argue for it. He was advocating for third way politics as a kind of integral political approach. And I think for the most part, because of that precedent, perhaps intellectually, and just in terms of the disposition of the other intellectuals he attracts, that centrism and kind of centrist liberalism has really kind of been at the center of integral theory in terms of its approach to politics, which has been a little unfortunate for folks like myself who have been advocating in the community for more progressive, more left-leaning ideas and values, etc. So wanted to set that into the context here. And, and this is where it gets interesting, because Wilber has written, you're probably going to find a book called Trump in a Post-Truth World, which Wilber wrote a few years ago. And a lot of Wilber's later writing tends to be a bit iterative and repetitive, kind of repeating the theory of the stage model and the quadrant model, and then sort of plugging it into what's going on in culture, rather than really genuinely kind of energized and connected and responsive ideas that are in the context of the moment. It's really kind of just plugging in the theory and going. But with Trump in a post-truth world, this is really where his politics begin to show that he too is blaming the rise of Trump and the conservative right on as a kind of backlash to the progressive left in culture. Obviously, all of this is missing a much more economic left approach in terms of understanding the material history of these politics and what actually might have driven the rise of Trump in terms of policies of neoliberalism, the collapse of the labor movement, and climate crisis, etc. I think this is what I talked to Michael about as well in our conversations. As a counterpoint to that, if you are going to read Trump in a post-truth world, I would recommend going ahead and reading Bruno Latour's Down to Earth, The Politics of the Terrestrial, as a response. And I think Latour does a much better job assessing what's actually going on right now with the climate crisis. And that was written around the same time as Wilber's Trump in a Post-Truth World. So, be warned, Wilber has been courting the IDW to very open extent, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. Yeah, I'm not familiar. Armando's asking about Bourdieusian sociology. I'm not exactly familiar with making with that or making that connection. So if you want to elaborate on that, Armando, that'd be great. But so yeah, this is sort of where, and hopefully we're going to do with Ryan Nakade and Matt Hudkins, we're going to do a little book review analysis episode of Trump in a Post-Truth World, just to really get into the details there. But I also want to take this moment to invite anyone in the TMBS community, in my community, the so-called integral left that we've been promoting, to engage with us in these kinds of conversations. And if there is an interest in doing a kind of a book club, critically reading integral theory, I think that there's an opportunity here. And, it's unfortunate that we really couldn't explore that opportunity to its fullest extent. With Michael, obviously, a lot of the plans that he had going into the fall was to really kind of bring forward integral theory. And one of the projects we had hoped to explore was a kind of, I was calling it the TMBS guide to integral theory, but it's really kind of what you'd expect in terms of Michael's thinking. He's interested in integral theory. He was interested in it in terms of what it could offer the left, in terms of how it could train us to think and be more effective. And I still think that is true. But now it's really going to take everyone, and it was always going to take everyone, but now it really is going to take everyone. If they're interested in picking up those texts and bringing them into conversation with the left, in the left's historical literature and theory, and understanding a deep material analysis, a deep historical material analysis of how we got to where we are, and trying to reconcile that with an integrative meta theory. I think that would be very exciting to see happening. And in many senses, this also takes us to some of the substance beyond the theory that I think needs to be spoken about, which is, Michael called it the consciousness dimension. He's saying spirituality is important. And one of the arguments he often made that I agree with in terms of relating to or speaking with the IDW is intellectual dark web is this: we need to be able to have a sense of spiritual literacy to understand why there is an appeal for meaningful symbolic language about the world. This is not something we should have hubris about. And there's a lot of bad thinking, and there's a lot of illiteracy in terms of historical, economic history here in terms of what's happening today. Yes, absolutely. But that does not discount the reality of symbolic language as something that is integral to being a human being, nor does it discount the validity or reality of poetic, spiritual, subjective experience. And I always put it this way, in the sense that we are meaning-making creatures, and we live under conditions that are always seeking to alienate us from our meaning-making capacities and living fulfilled, decent, meaningful life, right? These are the conditions under which we are struggling to liberate ourselves. And the kind of material economic world that we want to see actualize, whatever is post-capitalist, is a world in which that meaning-making should be embraced and fulfilled in a way that makes sense, right? So when we see, and this is what I talked about during the IDW rise and conversations about Jordan Peterson, when we see people flocking and watching these videos and very interested in long-form conversations about Jungian myth and biblical studies and how to live one's life, there is a deep, deep spiritual hunger for meaning-making in our culture that is not being satisfied endemically by the culture in which we are situated. And secondarily speaking, this was the argument Michael often made about, we need a spirituality for the left. We should not yield spirituality to the right and yield it to anyone else who wants to take it up, like the IDW, in terms of how it gets lumped in with all their other arguments. I think Peterson's a great example of this, in the sense that whatever you think of Chaos Dragons and all that stuff, people liked his lectures, and they're very popular. Meteorically popular. And I think the reason for this popularity is because he was approaching this myth-making, symbolic world that, again, is integral to being human. Which brings us to integral theory, integrative thinking, that this is a dimension we have to accommodate. This is a dimension that we have to think about and find a way to constructively synthesize with our own understanding of material history. We don't necessarily have to not be materialists, or not even necessarily give up being secularists. I myself, being sort of in the philosophical end of things, I consider myself to be something like an atomist and a panpsychist. I think there's very interesting arguments for this, and I think the fields in academia that might be of interest for those who are curious could be found in consciousness studies. They could be found in post-humanism, in post-colonial studies. So we're really talking about, and this is my argument for that in this sense of integrative thinking. The integral turn is also really opening up to the plurality and kind of an ecumenical approach to how we see the world and understand the world, from indigenous thinking, from other non-secular cultures and communities. We live, humanity is a planetary species. We have very different cultures, and not all of them are secular, but they can be allies in building a better material world. So regardless of whether you necessarily believe that religion and spirituality are important personally for yourself. You may not find them important. You may find them, just conceptually interesting. I think we have to do better, and I think the left has to do better in accommodating spirituality. And there's a lot of interesting thinkers and scholars that are talking about this as well from different fields: sociology, anthropology, religious studies, etc. And obviously, I'm kind of coming from the hippie background, coming at leftist theory and attempting my own approach at a proposed synthesis here. And I think Michael was coming at this from, obviously being brilliantly rooted in a systemic knowledge of a Marxist, progressive leftist economic discourse, right? He was so deeply read in the traditions of the literary left and the labor movement that obviously he was deeply grounded and in a good position to begin to speak about spirituality. I think myself, being in the hippie counterculture quite openly, but recognizing some of the limitations of many of my communities, being too averse to actually understanding that material history, and finding important knowledge on consciousness in that material history, I was frustrated with that as well. So I think our frustrations kind of brought us together in our collaborative project, which is, again, it's unfortunate, but at the same time, I hope that there are other people out there on the left who are interested in this. I've found a lot of you already, so it's been quite, it's been some consolement, I guess, after losing Brooks this summer, and then Graybird as well, very recently, at the beginning of this month. So, this is, again, an invitation to do reading, to explore this literature together, to do this research together. What I hope to do is to, as a project, is to really kind of take the notes Michael and I were working on, some of his own lectures and transcripts, and edit it into something that's at least readable, that is a launching pad for this kind of conversation. And so that's one of my projects that I've been working on, and I hope to share more of that soon. So Armando was mentioning about the Bourdieusian sociology. He says he maps symbolic space onto social space, shows how they are mutually structuring and structurally homologous. Interesting. That does sound very, very similar to quadrant theory. There is another, again, not directly related, but certainly a kind of training wheel process. There's a great essay by Neri Oxman called "The Age of Entanglement." Now, Neri Oxman is an architect and designer at MIT. I think she's brilliant. I think she's an integral thinker. I don't know what she thinks about economics and labor and post-capitalism, but certainly her style of thinking that she is advocating for is useful. And so she has this great essay called "The Age of Entanglement," where she is adapting the Krebs cycle of creativity, which is mapped on, it's kind of a map of the metabolism of a cell and how a cell processes energy and goes through this cycle, Krebs cycle. And she's modeled her own laboratory environment off of this Krebs cycle, but added a lot more dynamism to it. And the whole idea is that when we jump across disciplines, when we are able to inspire each other in very kind of combinatorially creative ways, let's say you're an architect or you're an engineer, right? You might inspire an architect to think poetically and redesign space. You might inspire a mathematician to in numeral form, kind of express that in their own innovations and their own thinking. That might as well turn into a movement in physics and a movement in art, right? So the idea is that the generation of novelty, innovation, synthesis, emergence, creativity, the energy needed for that is implicitly transdisciplinary or even anti-disciplinary. Everything's already entangled, and if we can have orienting frameworks that constantly remind us of this, we become better thinkers, we become better creators, we become more innovative in a sense. I don't want to use the word productive, but we certainly become much more effective and novel in our approaches. And so I think this is another way of, and I'll share the article with you guys, but this is another way of really considering what complexity thinking and integrative thinking really does. And in terms of the left and movement building, any way we can kind of hold all the different multi-systemic individual and collective and transmedia strategies that we need to hold, from art to rebuilding the labor movement and building unions again, right, to the climate crisis. We need that fluidity and complexity of thought. And so I really would recommend, very strongly would recommend actually, before you go ahead and read Wilber, to go in having read Neri Oxman's essay on anti-disciplinarity and the age of entanglement as another kind of, this is how we need to be thinking right now to solve a lot of these existential problems. And again, like I said at the beginning of this is not just on the left necessarily. This is like just across the board in terms of everyone needs to be thinking this way if we really want to solve the kinds of problems that we're facing right now, which are multi-systemic and fluidic, et cetera. It's like the situation we are being drawn into in the present is reflective of the kind of thinking we actually need to internalize. And it doesn't come easy for everyone, and we're in a social, environmental moment, and an economic moment where atomization and hyper-fragmentation and oppositionalism are constantly engendered and encouraged, right? So to cultivate this in ourselves as a practice is even more important. And I guess that leads me to the last point that he talks about in his videos in terms of empathy and spirituality. This is not merely a conceptual framework. This is really a kind of a state of consciousness that we have to cultivate, perhaps even daily. And there are states of consciousness that we can practice with in terms of meditation, different forms of meditation to enable us to slow down, to become present, to be able to take other perspectives, to be able to empathize with another human being, another subjectivity, and to be well developed enough in our capacity for equanimity to not simply react, but to truly act, right? To truly kind of come forward with our own creative engagement with the world. That is, I think, one of the most important things that meditation practice can give us. I will say this, though. There's been quite a few critiques against any kind of spirituality. Zizek has that very popular, talking about spirituality and make mindfulness as a kind of contemporary Protestant work ethic, and I think that's absolutely true. It has been catered to, basically mitigating the worst examples of contemporary lifestyle and being workaholics and being hyper productive and not collapsing. Right? I mean, there's a relationship between make mindfulness and the horrible suicide nets that were added to where Apple was making its iPhones in China, and that they're building these kinds of, one way or another, these nets to stop people from collapsing, under the pressures of modern neoliberal capitalism. So yes, it can be co-opted. I mean, so can social justice, right? So what I'm proposing and what I've been thinking about with this is these practices need an approach appropriate container. You know, Marshall McLuhan always talked about this. The medium is the message, right? Now, the practice of meditation for building empathy, taking perspectives, and then also restructuring society, right? That has to be a part of what is worked into the practice, right? The appropriate container for meditation should be radically post-capitalist or anti-capitalist in the sense that, you know, a deep affirmation of the not only singularity of a single, like of a human being, a deep subjectivity, meaning-making experience, being in the world with a different sense of time. But that should extend not to being a more productive worker, but to going, and I wish to be in the world and to relate to the world in a new way, right? In a new sense of time, with a new relationship to my material belongings and my family, right? There should be a proper container of relationship with the rest of the world based on mutual aid and compassion. These are very important principles that can't be simply shucked off for the central nugget of meditation. They shape the meditation in that sense. They might even radicalize the contemplative practices in such a way to empower, say, the left, but just really to empower a different way of being in the world in which we simply won't want to live in the way that we have been living under capitalism. I will recommend another book I didn't put in the show notes, but and then I'll just go through the show notes, and then I guess we could wrap it up, because I did recommend a couple of other books, and I'll just leave some notes about them. But Byung-Chul Han has a great book called The Scent of Time. It's a short little book. It brings in a lot of different thinkers, particularly Heidegger. But Han is an interesting German philosopher talking about the necessity of via contemplativa, right? And I think this sort of sums up an integral approach as well. He talks about the kind of culture which we have produced is all about via activa, right? Being active, being productive, being producing, of course, in terms of labor, any kind of our products, etc. We're in a highly commodified, hyper-productive world where we're expected to never stop, right? We're always on, right? The next quarter always has to make more money, and this is only ramped up under digital capitalism and the in terms of you know, not just even think about Silicon Valley, but just, you know, the entrepreneurial market. Everyone's working with the gig economy, so productivity and activity has been ramped up to an almost limitless speed, an inhuman speed. And Han is saying that to counteract that, to build a genuine labor movement, we need to, in a certain sense, liberate the body of labor by enabling it to inhabit time and space differently. And what does that mean in the practical sense? It means to value and inhabit in our own subjectivity, right? In our own intersubjectivity, the kind of culture we want to produce, a contemplative culture, a culture that has slowed down, which values the slowing down, which values the space of unproductivity, right? That values the unproductive, contemplative spaces of relationality, empathy, culture making, art, etc. These are not just leisurely bourgeois tasks, but the actual deeply human capacity to be in the world, in a place, relating to one another, creating things with, making things again, but not in that, again, that kind of very active sense, but in the slow sense, right? Learning arts, learning different disciplines. But via contemplativa as a kind of counterweight to a society of profound eco and egocidal destructiveness in terms of, you know, where we're headed right now, the larger climate crisis. So, you know, that brings in, again, this sense of why contemplative right? Via contemplativa, contemplative practices, meditation, mindfulness, uh, mindfulness retreats even, we need to bring in the consciousness dimension in terms of what we value as a culture. And I think it's so vital. It's so vital right now because that enables us it permits us to have a different relationship with time, not a time that is always ramping up to a faster and faster degree. All this to say, I want to jump for a moment to a little bit of commentary that I made in the show notes here. I linked to a bunch of Michael Brooks videos, just him talking about Marx, IDW, interval theory. Link to his book, to the TMBS show Patreon and Twitter. And I listed a few books. There's a few resources for you. There's the Lindisfarne Association tapes, which are really good. Just dive in there. Just fantastic lectures that you can explore. There's, of course, book recommendations from A Theory of Everything by Ken Wilber, Seeing Through the World, which is my own book. You can see that right here. Seeing Through the World, Gene Gebser, and Integral Consciousness. Now, William Irwin Thompson, which I didn't really get to him too much, but he was the founder of the Lindisfarne Association in the 70s, and he's got some fantastic books. This one is Coming Into Being, Artifacts and Texts and the Evolution of Consciousness. Just go ahead and read it, and you'll see why Michael Brooks found him so interesting. Another book Michael mentioned quite a bit is we've had 100 years of psychotherapy, and the world's getting worse. And he mentions Hillman in Against the Web to, again, talk about a much more integrated approach to psychotherapy, which is a point that James Hillman, an American depth psychologist, called himself an archetypal psychologist, made as a counterpoint to Jordan Peterson, that it is not enough to clean your room. We cannot have a highly atomized, individualized psychology that is addressing the ailments of the singular person and ignoring the social conditions which might produce unwellness, which might produce sickness, psychological sickness, right? So obviously these larger historical sociological conditions need to be looked at for an integral psychology to truly be addressing the health and well-being of a single individual. They're connected, the individual and the collective. Very basic stuff, but really we have to apply that. It is not enough, of course, to go ahead and clean your room if the environment around you is also sick. It, of course, is not an excuse to go ahead and blame the environment on your own reasons for sickness and ailments and not do anything about it for yourself. Of course you can clean your room. Of course you can take care of yourself in spite of these conditions. But your individual situation is intimately linked to the whole, right? The individual and the collective are both important, and they're non-reducible. And that's really the usefulness of beginning to think with any of these particular models, is eventually you drop the model and you really just have to look at the world in that way, right? How do we really internalize that mode of thinking? I've also mentioned in here, Light in the Dark. I mentioned this in the TMBS interview. Rewriting Identity, Spirituality, Reality by Gloria Anzaldúa. It's an adaptation of her thesis. I put Anzaldúa in here. She's a fantastic scholar, a feminist, or she was, from Mexican heritage. So she brought a lot of, her book Borderlands is very famous in feminist literature. But her thesis, I think, is underappreciated because she was putting forward, again, a spirituality for the left in the sense of regeneration being significant, post-colonialism, the fluidity of identity, the complexity of being on the borders, which has been an ongoing theme for her, and the times in which we live in terms of being intermingling light and dark, deconstruction and reconstruction. I think she really speaks to the times that we're in a very similar way that I would say maybe Gebser, Gene Gebser, another integral thinker, speaks to the times in which we're in, and check out my book for that. I already mentioned Counterculture to Cyberculture, and I wanted also to leave a link here. There's so much more to speak to, but there's a great little conversation between Daniel Wall, who is a regenerative thinker and scholar, and Michelle Bowens, who was going to be on TMBS to talk about the peer-to-peer movement in terms of thinking about the commons. Peer-to-peer movement in the commons is something I didn't bring up, but I think this is also part of the wave of literature and thinking that the left really would do well to internalize in terms of particularly the peer-to-peer and the commons movement, right? So we're thinking of ways in which we can reclaim not only labor in the social space, right, but the understanding the history of the loss of the commons, and innovative ways in which we can be rethinking economics that is human-centric and also planetary and bioregional. Right? So these, they fit together hand in glove in terms of the peer-to-peer movement, the commons studies movement, really kind of overlapping, and then the regenerative culture movement, which is looking more at ecosystems, bioregeneration, economic models that would function well in terms of helping to remediate the biosphere and also allow human beings to flourish. I mean, we need to be thinking about this stuff right now. And if we don't think this is related to fighting for a revival of labor, then we're not thinking integrally, in terms of how these are transparent to one another. What we're trying to do, right, the processes of atomization, what we're trying to do is to overcome that alienation and that atomization, right? How do we truly rebuild the commons and the social sphere in the 21st century in an age of the techno market and in an age of climate collapse? We really do need to be thinking about alternatives to capitalism, viable constructive synthesis, and different models and approaches that we can offer people on the ground as possible lines of flight out of our late capitalist climate collapse civilization, right? And I think this again is where we go all the way back, why the countercultures and the consciousness culture has always been interesting, has always had some element that that should be genuinely looked at, right? In terms of these are new and innovative ideas and systems and proposals that have different styles of thinking that are concordant with many of the struggles on the left in terms of imagining a post-capitalist future. So why don't we bring our rigor and our analysis and our constructive regenerative spirit to look at those and actually fold them into our approach and to offer something to people that isn't just a critique, but also an offering, right? It's also a constructive vision of what the future could be, because that is the only way an effective left could really, arguably, scale, is to have that vision, right? To have that meaningful vision of a constructive future. And I would say this as well, that as we keep digging deeper and deeper into climate collapse, really, these kinds of models and systems and modes of thinking, which are looking both at material history, the ecological material history, and then also the human social history of consciousness, are going to become increasingly important as we try to learn new modes of thinking, being, and relating with each other in the world that are genuinely capable of superseding a mode of consciousness that has engendered capitalism. They are integral to one another. Again, So let me just take a look at some of the comments, and then we can spend the next 10, 15 minutes kind of wrapping it up here and looking at some of our comments. Yes, so Armando was also mentioning Adorno, Horkheimer, Benjamin discussed the relationship between magic, myth, and modern reason in a way that possibly resonates with Gebser, but from a historical materialist angle. Yeah, they do. And to add to that as well, I think Deleuze obviously, his own way, talks about that relationship and probably draws some of his thinking from that history there. Particularly, this is something Connor Habib mentioned. I can't remember the name of this book in particular. Maybe you guys can help me recall it, but it was a text you did, you talked about during a Mutations live stream, about the relation between the theological imagination of capitalism, right? That there is a theology of capital, which is part of why it's been so successful and so destructive, right? And capturing. And if we really want to overcome capitalism, right, we really need to look at the theological and religious element to it, or the magical element to why it has captured the world in that sense. I can't remember it, but I'll certainly post it later. And again, the historical materialist angle, there's nothing wrong with it, and there's plenty of good commentary that opens the door to have a deeper conversation on consciousness. That is not easily deconstructed. I'm sorry, like the hippie stuff has some strength. And again, when we're talking about coalition building, you want the consciousness hippies on your side in terms of they're going to be the alternatives to Jordan Peterson in terms of talking about myth and symbol, etc. Also mentioning ADHD in children has been attributed to rapid fire culture and rapid fire consciousness. Well, the speeding up, right? The intensity and speeding up of culture is kind of the logic of techno-capitalism. A lot of interesting literature on that. I mentioned Paul Virilio in my book and his work on dromology as a kind of a logic of the machine world. And one of the reasons I've always kind of argued that leftists should take a look at Gebser is, he also spoke of this kind of logic of the machine world in his own way when he's discussing the invention of the steam engine, James Watt, and the kind of the implicit style of thinking and allure of speed, right? The allure of two things, right? He connects the invention of the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution concordantly with, or perhaps synchronistically, it's a better word, with the French Revolution, right? And he says there is this sort of historical intensification that is taking place there, where the machine world, the Industrial Revolution, and then also the kind of the political world, the rise of the left, the emergence of the revolutionary left, both kind of go hand in hand with each other in terms of the releasing of forces that are not capturable by industrial, in my own words, industrial capitalism, but are unleashed into the world, right? There's an intensity, a speeding up of time and history, an acceleration of things, which is sort of built into this logic, this inability to reckon with the true forces in which industrial capitalism have opened up, right? Which is, for Gebser, time. It's this deep relationship to time, an intensity of time. And I mentioned this in some of my other internal lectures on Patreon. The fantastic literature on time, like I mentioned already, Byung-Chul Han, but then also I think again, Virilio is great at speaking of dromology and sort of the temporal speeding logic of the machine. The symbol perhaps of industrial capitalism is embodied in the motorcycle, right? Racing into the mega city of Neo Tokyo and in Akira. I use that as the example in my book. But then also, you can look at Andreas Malm's work and his conversation about, really we need to think about it, how we relate to time, because the climate crisis is nature asserting itself over industrial capitalism in such a profound way, it renders us completely helpless. So there's that on one hand, and the deep time that the climate crisis is forcing us to reckon with, right? Millions, perhaps billions years old fossil fuels, centuries now of industrial extraction, right, of carbon into the atmosphere, warming of the planet, and then also the current moment in which we feel we can't slow down this this economic industrial ratcheting up of speed, right? There's a kind of velocity to the contemporary world which has been compounding exponentially. So there's a sense of helplessness to slow down, a sense of helplessness to control the economic market, the market driving force for techno-capitalism, industrial capitalism. Even in the face of our own destruction, there's a resistance and a reticence to do anything about it, right? And then on the other hand, the presence of the future, the sense that what we are doing now is, even now, is going to affect hundreds or thousands of years into the future and future generations, future species. So there's this temporal entanglement that the industrial age enunciates in a way. Timothy Morton also speaks about this. So time is very important. Again, this is why I think Gebser is so vital. Another thinker on the left to bring in is Mark Fisher, right? And Mark Fisher's books on capitalist realism, obviously that book in particular, and then also Ghosts of My Life, where he's talking about time as well. And for Fisher, I have some disagreements with how he's talking about this, or perhaps some distinctions. But he as well is very interested in the phenomena of time in the production of culture, and how, of course, the capturing of human imagination in a totalizing capitalist realism eventually creates a form of stasis, of canceled futures. Now, I still think he's orienting the future in a very kind of modernistic, linear sense of progress, but it's not necessarily a bad progress in the sense of post-capitalist society is where he wants us to be headed. So ultimately, I do agree. Just the framing of it, I think, could be a little different. I would say the engendering of the new, the capacity to not be rigidly stuck in not only an economic material system, but the mode of consciousness that goes with it. We're trapped there, and that's sort of where the stasis is taking place. So Mark Fisher is another good guy to talk about time with, consciousness. Interesting. Douglas, hey Douglas, what would you ideally like to happen in the conversation between two cultures, integral and leftist political? Where do you foresee this collaboration going? So, yeah, it's a great question, and it's something Michael Brooks and I did talk about. And first of all, I think he wanted to, and this is like, I think part of the goals for TMBS was to use the leverage as a platform for scaling a genuine labor movement that had incorporated meaning making. Didn't just give it up for the IDW to take over, but a consciousness dimension, a meaning making dimension, and then also integral thinking itself as a sort of form of complexity thinking was really a tool to offer that movement building in terms of the organizers and the media producers, and perhaps even the labor movement itself in terms of any of the organizers in the labor movement. Just like getting everyone to think strategically and using integrative thinking as the template for that strategy building. Okay, how do we address different communities on the right and on the left? How do we address different in terms of the class struggle? How do we approach this with the working class? How do we approach this with the more liberal upper middle class communities? So there was a kind of he hoped, I think, to offer this as a sort of pedagogical tool to scale the left and to scale an effective movement. And that's what I think what it came down to. How do we actually construct an effective movement that is on the ground and has a robust enough theoretical and historical literacy to get things done, right? And so I think that's what he saw in terms of what integral theory could offer. Also, again, what I was saying at the end here about offering something that is a constructive, regenerative vision of the future. And I think that's where not only integral theory, but also a lot of these regenerative and peer-to-peer practices, they all came in, because you're not just going in to do this political battle. And rebuilding the labor movement would be fantastic and a wonderful achievement, especially right now. Things are so dire right now. But to also have this vision in the sense of, like Bernie was advocating for in the Green New Deal, what is the constructive vision for the future? And what are alternatives that we can pivot towards in terms of post-capitalist futures? To really have that integral thinking. And a lot of these countercultural communities, he saw the left really finding an alliance with that. And in a way, I will say this as well, and this is where some people, my colleagues, also talk about this. And genuine coalition building might also mean not just doing this. I mean, it's not just doing this for the left, but also we need viable models for everyone, right? If we're going through this climate crisis, collapse, and transition, everyone's coming along with us. And so I think the left, a vision of the left that could become more ecumenical, less partisan, more coalition building, right? And really as a kind of struggle for everyone, right? In terms of building a better world that is sustainable, that treats people with decency, and that doesn't destroy the environment, collapse, the biosphere. So that's a big answer to that question, but effectively two things: pedagogical for labor movement building, and actually building an actual movement on the ground, and then also critical in the sense of really distancing the movement from partial solutions that are still way too rooted in certain economic and social and even consciousness models and how we see each other in an oppositional way. Integral in the ultimate sense as post-fragmentary, right? Regenerative, integrated, not only transdisciplinary, but also remedial, right? It's orthogonal. Someone on the Integral Left Forum mentioned that this is not just about the polarities of left and right, but it's even orthogonal to that in the sense that it's a completely different remedial trajectory to kind of really work at healing the planet and to be an effective movement to do that. So what I would like to see is just this conversation continuing. There's already, I think, because of Michael and also others like him, I think there is a genuine interest in having those kinds of conversations across these different communities. I myself feel that way, and I've felt that way since I've been in the integral community. Very interested in, well, let's say like the internationalism or extinction conversations going on right now. I think the international community is beginning to really think about how we can make this a genuine movement, not only of intellectuals, but also of projects on the ground. And one that, again, is very ecumenical. Yeah, thanks, Fred. Wonderful to see you give the deeper context for current integral contemplation. Well, yeah, I think this sort of that is the kind of general approach to the class that's coming up, which is how do we find a way, right, to bring in that process of slowing down, that slow urgency that Bayo Akomolafe talks about, becoming present, and the radicality of that becoming present as well, at least cultivating the appropriate container to see that as a radical act, to be in the world in a way that advocates for a different relationality, one that is more based on mutual aid, a non-extractive economics system, a post-industrial society, and to really kind of be in the world in that way and to advocate for that is folded into our being. So Armando was also mentioning, Marx was not a reductionist, deterministic materialist. Yeah, I mean, I think that was his brilliance was in analyzing material history, but he certainly wasn't a reductionist himself, I wouldn't say. And yeah, contrary to common assumptions, the other side of this too, I think he has perhaps been, and this is also what I think has been difficult on the left in building a culture of non-reductionists. A spirituality on the left is really kind of shunned or looked down upon. It's sort of a knee-jerk reaction. So I would say there is a culture around Marxism which tends to be, at its worst, favoring, or excluding other approaches. So it kind of, is it reductionist? I wouldn't go that far. There's plenty of variety on the left, especially the so-called, Marxist-oriented left. But yes, I think the spiritual dimension is still missing, but Marx himself, I don't think we could say was any kind of reductionist. Any interest in Bernard Stiegler? I haven't really looked into his work deeply, but I'm wondering why you're making that connection. Yeah, good questions. So let's see if there's any other commentary here before we wrap it up. I feel like it ended up doing a stream of consciousness rather than necessarily a careful breakdown of that video. But I think we hit the main points, right, in terms of having techniques and tools to build empathy, complexity, fluidity of mind and perspective taking, having a different orientation in relationship with time, which contemplative practices via contemplativa engenders in us, and again, the capacity for making synthesis, which not only needs to be on the left, but something we do as a culture as a whole, right? And maybe one of the reasons why, like, I personally find myself very comfortable associating with the left is probably because, in terms of the historical tradition of being on the left in the past century and this century, who else is talking about a post-capitalist, perhaps post-industrial culture that is not merely arguing to escape or to flee from modern society, right? Because there are romantic conservative movements, of course, that don't like capitalism either. But those, I would argue, are attempting a retreat, and I think we need to think about this, and this is why the left is coming as an integral thinker at the left rather than a leftist looking at integral. We need to have a sense of, okay, well, here is a community, a tradition that is deeply looking at the material reality of things, and then deeply reflecting on the possibility of transforming that material reality, right? That is the creative element that I don't necessarily see on the right, certainly almost not at all, right, in that sense. I do think there are things we can align with on the right in terms of we want to get post-capitalist, but the kind of vision I think needs to be, it belongs to the left and the history of the left, and just in terms of who's been putting it forward, who's been actively working on this. And for all the criticism about needing a constructive left and a synthetic left that's not just attacking and deconstructing, for all that criticism, again, the history of the left is as a rich, diverse tradition in the 20th, 19th centuries. Now the 21st again has been, what if we could do this differently? What if we could make the world differently? That foundation alone is cause enough to remain inquiring, like, well, okay, what have they learned? You're not from the left. As an integral thinker, in the integral community perhaps, or in the consciousness culture, you would want to acquire that literacy and use the tools that the left has offered as well in terms of material analysis, in terms of already the experiments in terms of thinking post-capitalist and enacting a post-capitalist culture. The tools to get there, the tools to navigate there, both in terms of the consciousness culture, complexity, planetary thinking, right? Post-materialist spirituality, and on the other hand, a deep and rooted historical legacy of profound analysis that needs to be incorporated if we actually want to realize this future. Both are interested in the future, and I guess that's why I'm very comfortable there as well. All right, I think that's it for today, but this is really fun. Maybe we'll keep doing these on a more weekly basis or bi-weekly basis. I'm glad that the YouTube live stream worked out just okay and not to get totally messed up, with the exception of that at the beginning. But yeah, I would love to do this more often. We're going to have some guests on as well next month. I am talking with a few folks like Ben Burgess, who I would love to speak about cosmopolitan socialism and the left and climate and his whole perspective on all that. And then, of course, I haven't reached out to Michelle Bowens yet. We had previously, but I'm going to have him on sometime soon. We're going to keep these conversations going as the class continues or starts next month, and as I'm working on my writing. So thank you, everybody. It's been great, and I will see you next week for the next live stream. Have a good afternoon, everyone.